Every year, Genshin releases a summer event that foreshadows some of the key elements from the upcoming region, or at least they used to do that. But this trend seemed to stop with the release of Natlan's Easy Breezy Resort event, since that was actually a permanent addition to the game rather than a limited time story like all the other ones had been. But in hindsight, the assumption that they stopped the foreshadowing appears to be false. The resort does seem to have foreshadowed some elements of Nod Krai, but just in more subtle ways than we're used to. For example, you could argue that Bennett's story foreshadowed Columbina's story, since both of them had their families sacrifice their lives in a space outside the boundaries of time so that the two of them could live. And you can argue that the Bakunawa side quest mirrors Rerir's story, since they both deal with themes of being blown to pieces and slowly reassembling themselves in an endless cycle, also within a realm outside of time. And that made me curious about some of the other potentially subtle instances of foreshadowing, because immediately following the events of Act 8, lore hunters everywhere started pointing out the visual similarities between this painted sculpture side quest at the resort and Sandrone's reworked version of the world formula. But this comparison in particular is kind of problematic from a foreshadowing perspective, because that variation of the world formula is one that we've never seen before. So assuming the developers intended for this quest to foreshadow the use of the world formula, there must be something about this sculpture that links it to the original formula that we saw in Fontaine. Only problem is, the game isn't super clear on what the world formula actually is or what it really does. I mean, it's obviously talked about like a mathematical formula that predicts the future, but like, this statue doesn't exactly scream math to me. And I also didn't really understand the color theming going on here. So I can only assume that if this statue really is foreshadowing the world formula, there must be something else to it, something that we've missed. And after a little digging, I think I know what it is. But before I satisfy your curiosity with my harebrained pattern matching and theorizing, I must extend my thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Eniba, my preferred top-up shop for in-game currency, game keys, software, and more. Now look, I know there's a lot of options out there for topping up your account and buying game keys, but my preference always goes to Eniba because they focus on making sure your transactions are safe, secure, and compliant with the terms of service for all the games they cater to. And that's such a big deal when you're faced with an internet full of scams and fine print. And Eniba's cashback program is really just icing on top of that nice security cake. I mean, you're getting money back to put towards your next purchase just because you went with the most secure option for a top-up site. Seems like a pretty great deal to me. And of course, using Eniba to top up is easy. All you have to do is pick your game, select your desired currency package, then enter your server region and UID. Finish things off with your payment information and your purchase will end up in your account in a matter of minutes. Or if you're anything like me and you like to surprise your friends, you can always enter the server region and UID of their accounts instead and gleefully watch their flabbergasted expressions as their cutscene is interrupted by an unexpected delivery of summoning currency. Now at time of recording, Zabai is our featured Genshin Impact character courtesy of Lantern Rite, and she's also the only horse in the entire game, which makes her very rare indeed. But if you prefer to perpetuate the myth of horses not existing in Teyvat, perhaps you'll be more interested in picking up a copy of Varka instead, since he's coming up next. He is the one that we've been blaming for stealing all of the horses in Teyvat for the last 5 years, but turns out he actually didn't do that, so we probably owe him an apology. Maybe a Primo Gem apology. It's your call. Whatever your decision, if you're looking for a safe and convenient way to top up your account or send a gift to a friend, you can use the link in the description to check out what Eniba has on offer. A big thanks to Eniba for sponsoring this video, and now I will attempt to provide a complete analysis of the world formula. And I can finally stop obsessing over the ambiguity of what this thing is and what it does. Does this mean that I'm making this video for my own peace of mind more than anything else? Yes. Yes, it does. But you are coming with me, so grab your tinfoil hat and let's go. Now, in case you didn't do or don't remember the Narzissenkreuz questline that was in Fontaine, or you weren't paying attention during that world quest recap they shoved inside the Archon Quest, here's a little background on what we know about the world formula. About 500 years ago, René de Petrichor discovered some Conrian texts during an expedition to the Sumeru Desert. We don't know the contents of these texts exactly, but we do know that René used them to reverse engineer the world formula, or at least develop his own interpretation of it. Throughout the quest, the formula is presented as some kind of mathematical equation that can be used to take important data points from the past and use them as variables to calculate future events with some level of accuracy. But even though that was kind of how it was presented, we know that the world formula is not a singular equation, because Renee calls it a computational scheme, which is not a singular equation. A scheme in mathematics is something like a framework or a methodology that you use to solve a given problem. So for example, if you had a problem that you wanted to solve but did not possess a simple equation to solve it, you could use a scheme to develop the equation that would solve your problem and give you the answer that you were looking for. The computational aspect of the computational scheme just means that you're trying to compute something using that scheme. So basically what Renee had developed was a methodology for creating equations that could predict the outcomes of specific events using certain types of variables. In other words, every event you wanted to look at would require a different equation that you could use the world formula to assemble or create. But schemes aren't limited to just creating mathematical equations. Like I said, they are just a methodology for how you develop a solution to your problem. So there are a lot of different types of schemes out there. And in fact, you probably use these all the time. And I say that because schemes are, like I said, instructions on how to create methods to solve problems. And for that reason, they can be, and often are, visually represented as diagrams or flowcharts. This is part of the reason why sets of instructions are often called schematics or schematic diagrams. And it's also why guidelines for choosing or grouping colors, for example, are called color schemes. Complementary colors are a color scheme. You choose those colors based on the schematic. The scheme defines the rules for these groupings or choices. Now, for some reason, which we will be investigating shortly, Renee chose to illustrate his world formula scheme as the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. This might seem like a pretty arbitrary choice at first, but the reference itself is actually very appropriate because the Tree of Life is actually supposed to be a schematic diagram that illustrates how reality is formed. We're not going to go into the details of how the Tree of Life actually works in practice because that's very deep and complicated, but if you were to oversimplify the whole thing and apply it to Genshin's logic, then the Tree of Life is basically telling us how the world was created or how the world is constantly recreating itself. To put it another way, it could be seen as a diagram that illustrates the trajectory of the world, or rather, how the past shapes the future. And it does this by defining the rules under which Teyvat operates. Now, Renee didn't base his work entirely on Conrian documents, though. A group of Remurians, known as the Golden Troop, had also attempted the development of a world formula of their own, which they called Fortuna, named aptly after the Roman goddess of fortune and fate. And that fits pretty well with the world formula being portrayed as a sort of predictive model of the future, right? That's some nice positive reinforcement. And we can find more of that positive reinforcement in the Archon Quest, because in Acts 7 and 8, Sandrone goes to great lengths to refine Renee's world formula and goes on to describe her version of the formula as an algorithm that's capable of constructing a framework of rules. So through all these contextual clues, we can assume that these rules are the computational scheme that governs Teyvat, and the world formula is an attempt to replicate those schematic rules. And if Teyvat governs itself on principles of fate, then the world formula is an attempt to reverse engineer the ways in which the heavenly principles calculates fate. Well, not how the heavenly principles calculates fate, because I don't think they're actually the ones doing the fate calculation. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's more that they're reverse engineering the algorithm that the heavenly principles made. Allegedly. Now, you probably didn't need this whole preamble to figure out the whole fate calculation aspect of the world formula, especially since Sandrone straight up says it in the Archon Quest, but this foundational information is important as far as understanding how Teyvat actually works with the world formula, at least in theory. Because see, while Renee used the world formula to predict the fate of Fontaine, Sandrone used it to predict the fate of Columbina, but backwards. Because Sandrone wasn't trying to predict the fate of Columbina. Sandrone was trying to calculate all possible fates of Columbina in order to find the one where she came back to Teyvat. Then she would know the conditions under which Columbina could return to Teyvat, and then everyone could work together to make sure that those conditions were fulfilled. And honestly, that's probably why Sandrone's world formula required so much more computing power than Renee's. Well, that, and she also wanted more precise results. But it's actually this connection to fate, both forwards and backwards, that may explain why and how the 7-colored statue at the resort foreshadowed the use of the world formula. Now grab your tinfoil hats, because this is where I start heavily speculating. So Sandrone based her formula on Renee's formula, and while Renee's formula heavily references the Kabbalistic Tree of Life diagram, it's very likely that he's referencing a very specific variation of the Tree of Life diagram. See, Renee's Narzissenkreuz Ordo references Rosicrucianism, which gave rise to several secret societies, bodies, one of which was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of which one notable Aleister Crowley was a member. Now, I'm pretty sure the Golden Troop of Remuria is supposed to loosely allude to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which matters because Crowley developed his Telema philosophy and religion based on his time with the Order of the Golden Dawn, in a similar way that Rene based his World Formula and Narzissenkreuz Ordo on the Golden Troop. And this matters because the Narzissenkreuz Ordo is full of Telemic references. They're all over the place. And for that reason, I think it's reasonable to assume that Rene's Kabbalistic world formula may reference the Telemic version of the Tree of Life, which, according to Crowley's book, The Complete Astrological Writings, deviates from the traditional Tree of Life in one very interesting way. It associates each node, or Sephiroth, with a planet. I want you to take another look at the 7-colored statue, and then I want you to compare it to this device. This device is an interplanetary clock made by Chronova Engineering. Each planet in our solar system has its own orbit and rate of spin, so each planet measures time differently. This clock calculates and displays the time differences between each planet relative to each other. Now, I think there's a pretty striking resemblance between this clock and this statue, but I know for a fact that Hoyo did not base the 7-colored statue off of this particular clock because at time of recording, this clock is only like 3 weeks old, and this event came out like a year ago. But the discovery of this clock set me out on a quest to find other interplanetary clocks that could have inspired this statue, and that had me looking at a bunch of other orreries, or rather, clockwork models of the solar system, because they're similar not only in their clockwork mechanism, but also in their function, except rather than trying to calculate differences in time between planetary bodies, they calculate the position of planets relative to each other, so space instead of time. Now, I concede that these orreries do not look anything like the statue or the interplanetary clock, unless you change your perspective and view them from above. Then they look very similar. And if you look into the history of orreries, you'll find out that most of them used to have just 7 classical planets, which would line up with the 7 colors on the statue. And I know someone's inevitably going to point out that there are 10 nodes on the Tree of Life, which means that we're missing at least 3 planetary bodies. And there can be anywhere from 7 to 8 planets in the solar system depending on whether or not you love Pluto. But here's the thing. The 7 classical planets were from a geocentric model of the solar system, and older civilizations didn't have really powerful telescopes, so they were limited to just the celestial bodies that they could see, which means that the original 7 classical planets were the Moon, the Sun, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, Mercury, and Mars. The Telemic version of the Tree of Life adds in the remaining 3 planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Earth. And interestingly, sometimes it also adds in Pluto as an 11th node. And the 11th node isn't always added in the Tree of Life, the same way Pluto isn't always included as a planet in our solar system anymore. So that leaves us with 7 planets plus 3 celestial bodies in the form of Earth, Sun, and Moon. So for this reason, and one we're gonna get to in a bit, I think this comparison is actually quite fair. Plus, Fate and Teyvat has always been directly linked to celestial bodies, so I don't think it's a stretch to say that the world formula might just be a type of astrology. We might even think of its calculations as being horoscopes. And this recontextualization is a bit funny because Rene used his world formula scheme to create the doomsday clock at the Ordo. But this doomsday clock is actually an astronomical clock. Rene designed it to count down the days until the arrival of Fontaine's apocalypse specifically. Certainly an interesting choice if there's no involvement of celestial bodies here. It's also worth pointing out that Mona's scryglass also bears a resemblance to an astronomical clock face, or a natal chart. So it's possible that her astrology and hydromancy are also variations of the world formula. And if this interpretation is accurate, then we could compare the world formula to a natal chart. The natal wheel would be like the computational scheme, much like Rene's Tree of Life, and then by plugging in certain variables about a specific person or entity, like their birth date and place, you'd end up with a fate calculation that's unique to them. One that you could use to look forward or backward throughout time. And while we're talking about astrology and hydromancy, we might want to look at the Hexen Circle that developed it, especially their book The Little Witch and the Undying Fire, because in Volume 2, which is full of astrological notes written by Barbeloth, she explains, by proxy of character, that planets and stars do have an influence on planet Teyvat and its inhabitants, but also that their influence has been greatly reduced by the presence of the firmament, which does make sense. The firmament is meant to protect and isolate Teyvat from the rest of the universe. But hold on a second. If fate is based on celestial bodies, but the planet is cut off from all the celestial bodies, then there's no way for the world formula to be properly referencing these celestial bodies unless we assume that these celestial bodies are a bit more localized. That is to say, they are inside the firmament. So my hypothesis is that in much the same way as Teyvat's stars are Irminsul fruit rock crystal things, which we're going to circle back to in a second, the planets must have some sort of physical form inside the firmament as well. Now the book goes on to call these ruling planetary bodies archons. Now the English localization of this passage is a little bit misleading. Instead of reading it literally like archons are planets and planets are archons, the more accurate read here is that all planets with sentient life have astrological influences forced upon them, which means we need to start thinking of archons not as literal planets, but as localized astrological influences, major factors of the world formula in Teyvat. Because here's the thing, the name Archon is given to 7 gods who are themselves associated with 7 classical planets, and we could represent each one via a different color, which is a pretty common practice and could be what the 7-colored statue was originally going for. But to be clear, I am not saying that the Archons in Genshin are planets, but I do think they may serve the same purpose when it comes to influencing fate within Teyvat. I think that's what Barbeloth is trying to convey in her volume of The Little Witch and the Undying Fire. Because in astrology, each planet has some concept that it rules over, and in Genshin, the Archons each have an ideal that they embody. So the presence of the Archons could be some sort of fixed set of influential factors or constant variables that must be accounted for when calculating fate within the world formula for Teyvat. And if that's true, then Nicole's lines about how difficult fate is to change for those who are not gods can suddenly be seen in a brand new light. Instead of suggesting that only powerful entities with high authority can move the needle of fate, perhaps she was trying to say that each archon is a factor or variable within fate's equation, and if you want to make significant changes, you need to adjust those variables. In other words, you need to change a constant variable into a fluctuating variable. Or alternatively, you could add in a new variable in the form of a descender, as Sandrone and Renee both hypothesized. It would be something like adding a new gear or planet into a Clockwork orrery, or an amendment to the rules that govern the world. But there is another reason why I honed in on the Clockwork orreries, and it's because our first real encounter with the world formula was in Fontaine, the homeland of all things clockwork within Teyvat. And Sandrone herself is made of clockwork, so the connection to me feels rather intentional. Besides that, ancient Fontaine is actually based off of ancient Greece and Rome, and the ancient Greeks created one of the oldest surviving clockwork orreries, the Antikythera mechanism. This mechanism was used to calculate all sorts of astronomical events, and it was crazy accurate considering its age. And it's also considered to be one of the oldest analog computers in existence, or at least the oldest surviving one. Now this here is a modern recreation of the Antikythera mechanism based on what fragments we do have and a lot of X-ray scans. And this is the gearing diagram for it. And I think this diagram should look pretty familiar because it is indeed a computational scheme, just like the world formula. Each node here represents one of the mechanism's gears, and the lines represent how each gear connects to the other gears. And since each gear represents the planets and other important celestial bodies, this is basically a relationship diagram for how planets move relative to each other. It represents the rules of the planet's movements. It's pretty neat, huh? But I do think it's interesting how we started off with an esoteric tree of life diagram that represents God's method of constructing reality and somehow managed to connect it to an analog astronomical computer that somehow predicts the future. But although you could blame a lot of this on a human's desire to find patterns in things that don't usually have patterns, I do think that these two things are far from unrelated because in Act 7, Sandrone calls Renee's world formula a basic tree model logical structure. Now, a tree model is basically any kind of graph, chart, or diagram that resembles a tree, and typically it's an upside-down tree. And I don't know about you guys, but an upside-down tree that predicts fate sure sounds an awful lot like Irminsul. It's been a long time since we were in Sumeru, so some of you probably forgot about this, but although Irminsul mostly serves as a repository of Teyvat's history, it is that very history that shapes Teyvat's future, and so Irminsul is intrinsically connected to the concept of fate within Teyvat. We also know that Irminsul is a structure very similar to the Loom of Fate, since the Loom of Fate can weave new ley lines, and the ley lines that currently exist are quite literally Irminsul's root system. Incidentally or coincidentally, I also made a video on how punch card looms are also the precursors to modern computing systems, which means that we've now got two of the oldest computers referenced by Irminsul here, the Yacard loom and the Antikythera mechanism. And as a side note, the connection between Irminsul, the Loom of Fate, and the world formula may suggest that the Conrian texts René de Petrichor used to develop his initial diagram could have been from the early drafts of the Loom of Fate project. I have no proof of this, but it would make a lot of sense in context. Now, a few years ago, I made a video about how I believed that the star rocks in the false sky were actually Irminsul fruits, and you can watch that video if you'd like because it's aged frighteningly well. But essentially, in that video, I connected the star from the Unreconciled Stars event to the Irminsul fruit fragments from the Energy Amplifier event. And in yet another video, I made another connection between Irminsul fruits and specters. Why? Well, because the shape of the specters are said to mimic the shape of the fruits of a giant tree in the sky. And this shape is perfectly replicated by knowledge capsules, which are packets of crystallized data from and for Irminsul. And if you completed the Aranyaka questline, you might remember the Bija, a fruit made of condensed memories by the Aranara. So not only do the Bija have a very similar shape and function to the knowledge capsules, but their creators, the Aranara, are noted as being related to the Spectre species. And that's a fun connection given that the Aranara are the familiars of the avatar of Irminsul herself. And now we know for absolute certain that Wanderer's body was carved from one of Irminsul's fallen branches, and as a sentient puppet, he possesses a core which looks something like this. And maybe it's just me, but I think this looks suspiciously similar to the Spectre's core, and also to knowledge capsules. So it seems to me like this might actually be an Irminsul fruit of sorts. And as I was writing this, I was reminded that Dottore modeled all of his segments off of Wanderer's construction methods, which means that he may also possess a similar type of core, because his segment bodies are probably made out of the same type of materials. And if that's true, then I would like to float the idea that this segment's core is also the so-called artificial moon marrow that he made. After all, moon marrows are also cores. And while it's not clear whether or not they are the same type of core as what Wanderer has, and we don't really know whether they were mechanical or biological, those details might not actually matter. Cause see, Wanderer's core is called a computational hub, which kind of makes it sound like it's his equivalent of a computer's CPU. But as it turns out, a computational hub is also a type of neuron within the brain that processes the information the brain receives as it receives it. So a computational hub does not have to be mechanical, it just has to process information. So if this computational core hub is an Irminsul fruit, then Irminsul fruits are like the neurons of a giant brain, or a mechanical imitation of a brain. Now, during the Archon Quest, Wanderer allowed Sandrone to use his computational core hub to run her world formula calculation on, because she otherwise lacked the computing power, and apparently the only thing capable of fulfilling her compute needs is Irminsul itself. And it's not like she could plug directly into the ley lines. So it's interesting to me that this fragment of Irminsul worked just as well as plugging into the tree directly, although probably not quite as fast. Now, I don't know about you, but this whole exchange made it seem very plausible, if not likely, that Irminsul's one and only job is to calculate the world formula at an incredible scale. Because think about it for a second. Irminsul might be described as a tree, but it's really this big digital infrastructure. Irminsul has so many references to computers, from its circuitry patterns to its own avatar emulating desktop haptic devices like cursor and keyboards, that if you missed them, I don't know what to tell you. So what we're left with is this big computer tree that encompasses the entire world and constantly calculates the future using a framework of rules that we call the world formula. And when you think about it this way, René's use of the Kabbalistic tree of life as his world formula schematic was really on point. Because he was literally trying to create a visualization of Irminsul's rule-based framework. But his approach was more analog than it was digital. And I also think it's right to say that Sandrone was correct when she called the world formula a tree model logical structure and described it as an algorithm capable of constructing a framework of rules. She was literally trying to reverse engineer the decision-making model of the world tree, but her approach was more digital. She was basically converting René's analog model into her digital model. But wait, there's more! Because there's that theory that's probably not actually a theory because it's probably lore about how the Heavenly Principles is actually the AI agent from the twin spaceship that came and colonized Teyvat? Well, for completely unrelated reasons, I was reading about how AI models are structured and how they work, and I stumbled upon this diagram. This is a simplified diagram or computational model of an artificial neural network, and it was designed to mimic biological neural networks. And if you rotate this thing 90 degrees, it starts to look a lot like Renee's Tree of Life schematic. Coincidence? Maybe, but I was not the first one to make this observation. This has apparently been a point of interest in the study of machine learning and neuroscience for a very long time. It's just one of those fun instances of synchronicity where metaphysics meets science. But they don't just look similar, they are functionally similar as well. The top of both schemes represents the input value, which gets run through the layered middle section to produce an output value at the end. And the more layers you have in the middle values, the more complexity you can have. And while the Tree of Life uses God's light as an input, the neural network uses sensory input, both of which can be interpreted as data. And in the case of Genshin, light encoded data. So we could say that the Tree of Life represents God's brain to some degree. Each node or sephirote is like a neuron, and the pathways between them are synapses. And what's even more interesting about this idea is that if each node is a neuron, we could also call them a computational hub. And if the computational hubs are Irminsul fruits and Irminsul fruits are stars, and stars make up constellations which dictate one's fate, then the lines that are drawn between those stars are like synapses, which is a pretty cool observation on its own. But there are countless constellations that make up the sky, which means this world formula is basically layered or tessellated throughout the entire sky. And this logically checks out when compared to the schematic of a neural network, because the more middle layers you add to a scheme, the more complex the thought process gets. And even this multi-layered diagram of an artificial neural network is congruent with the Tree of Life, because the Kabbalistic Tree of Life can be extended into a variation called Jacob's Ladder. This version of the Tree of Life is supposed to represent the ascension process of human consciousness towards the divine consciousness. So anyway you look at it, it's just brains, brains, brains all the way down. But if we are going to interpret these diagrams as brains or neural networks, then we should consider the fact that Irminsul's preservation of Teyvat's history is actually its attempt at harvesting and building a data set that it uses to presumably alter or create reality with. That's not just a logical conclusion, it actually fits very nicely with what we witnessed in Sumeru with the use of the Akasha system. And yeah, I know the Akasha system is not Irminsul, but it was made by the avatar of Irminsul, so it is very logical to assume that the Akasha system was modeled after Irminsul's core functionality. Because just like Irminsul, it served as a repository of data that it stole from the minds of those it was connected to. And not only was it able to use that data to create accurate predictive models, but it was actually able to create and manipulate entire worlds within a dreamscape. But what this effectively means is that the entire sky is just a giant distributed layered network of prediction models. So while we can think of constellations as sort of being tessellated world formulas layered across the sky that are connected to each other in a form of algorithmic codependence, we should also recognize that these predictive models are layered. So you could have an individual layer, a regional layer, and a global layer. And at that global level, archons serve as major variables or constants that define the rules that govern the calculations of the world formulas at the lower individual levels. But they're not the only global variables, they're just the ones that have been designated by the Heavenly Principles. See, Nouvelette's character stories talk about how people whose constellations are their own reflections have the ability to defy the world itself, which could suggest that they are also considered major variables, just one that the Heavenly Principles did not designate or recognize. In fact, that could explain why the Heavenly Principles triggered the Archon War to begin with. They were eliminating rogue variables, trimming those options down to just 7. And I think it's possible we can identify these global variables by their constellations. Because as you well know, every Archon possesses a constellation that is made of their own reflections, just as it says in Nouvelette's character story. But so too does the Traveler, and they're considered a variable from outside the system. And to that end, Columbina, a reincarnated moon goddess, also has her reflection as her constellation, meaning she is likely another major variable. And that does make me wonder if the Doctor's original goal was to simply establish himself as one of these major variables, the lunar variable, and from there he could replace each variable one by one. In that context, Wanderer appears to have been an excellent test case, because his constellation is now also a reflection of himself. But because he's not actually a part of Irminsul's dataset anymore, he's a forgotten or unknown variable. Now, my biggest issue with the way I've laid out this theory so far is that if Irminsul is indeed growing growing upside down in a way where its roots would be on the surface of Teyvat, like I said earlier, then that means its branches should be in the abyss. But we also have testimony that Irminsul's roots stretch into the abyss, which would mean that its branches make up the stars, which is the foundation for the whole stars are Irminsul fruits argument that I made. This inconsistency in the lore itself means that we're actually dealing with one of two situations. Either there's something really strange about how the planet is structured, like in those old theories where people were saying that Teyvat is actually upside down, which seems far less likely now that we've seen the whole planet from space and we can see that the whole planet is round and therefore cannot actually be upside down because it's a sphere. Or we have the second possibility that there are simply two trees that mirror each other. One of them goes up and one of them goes down. And the two-tree theory isn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. After all, the loom of fate can weave new ley lines. And if our current ley lines are the roots of Irminsul, then the loom of fate could potentially grow an entirely new tree in the abyss, equipped with its own root system of ley lines. And even from a Kabbalistic perspective, this works, because the Kabbalistic tree of life has a mirrored twin that resides in the darkness. And it's aptly named the Tree of Death, partly because of its association with destruction and evil things. But even that works in the theory's favor, because the original Loom of Fate operation wasn't trying to weave new ley lines. It was trying to obliterate those constant variables that the Archons represent. As my lore buddy Mish pointed out, the Abyss Order was trying to attach Osile to a machine to give it the ability to obliterate a divine throne, which is currently occupied by an Archon. And while the Abyss Order failed, Nouvelette, who is also a water Leviathan, who is also attached to a machine, the Oratrice, did manage to destroy one of the divine thrones with Focalor's assistance, and then he rebuilt it. This change in variable was actually described as changing fate itself. So we can assume that this constant variable of the Hydro Archon has been replaced. But I think the Abyss Order realized that changing one or two variables wasn't enough. So the Loom of Fate operation plan evolved from trying to destroy Irminsul's constant variables to, allegedly, making a second tree that could obliterate or overwrite the entirety of the first tree. Now that said, I gotta admit, the idea that Teyvat is some sort of simulation inside of a biological or artificial neural network of sorts is kind of at odds with my previous claims of Teyvat being a storybook serialization, which is why I've been avoiding revisiting this topic for a very long time, in spite of all the evidence to support a simulation theory. But recontextualizing the simulation theory to reference neural networks eliminates that disconnect for me, because you can argue that the world formula is just a diagram of how the story of the world is being imagined or written. It's just an illustration of like when you ask an LLM to write something for you. And the LLM's neural network is meant to mimic a biological network, so it doesn't matter whether or not the thought process diagram is supposed to be organic like Nibelung or artificial like the assumed to be AI heavenly principles in this case. The world is still operating under functionally the same rules. And this idea also works with the fact that the twins' Loom of Fate project produced a book that will weave new ley lines, because the twin is basically creating the seed of a story that will grow into a neural network tree, which I begrudgingly admit is a pretty cool concept. Although I would find it a whole lot cooler if Hoyoverse hadn't just written the story of Amphorius and Starrail, because that literally had a simulated world that was ruled by 12 variable factors, represented by Archon-like figures, with two potential AI gods that were warring with each other for control over the world. And by the end of everything, the whole simulated planet was turned into a book. Anyway, there's obviously a lot more I can say in connections throughout Teyvat that I can weave together to support this theory, like how phlogiston is computronium, or like all those references to psychohistory and Natlan, or the fact that Varka's original fate was apparently recalculated as soon as the Traveler arrived, and all the stuff that was supposed to be attributed to him was reattributed to the Traveler. And this had obvious knock-on effects, like the fact that Varka could now go to Nod Krai and do an investigation that probably wouldn't have otherwise happened. So there's plenty of rabbit holes we could continue going down, but I think I've laid some good groundwork for additional theorizing, so I'm just gonna leave it here. A massive thanks to all my channel members for patiently supporting these impulsive investigations of mine, and another big thanks to you for watching. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye bye for now.